Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on vicarious trauma and its impact. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled that you're here for ARAISA's first webinar. My name is Carolyn Whiteway, and I will be your moderator. I'm the Executive Director of ARAISA. ARAISA, otherwise known as the Atlantic Region Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies, is an umbrella association for organizations who play important roles in helping newcomers settle and integrate into our Atlantic Canadian communities. We are very fortunate today to have Vince Pietropaolo, the General Manager of COSTI Family and Mental Health Services, as our speaker today. He is a knowledgeable, experienced practitioner in the field and has presented extensively on these issues. I wanted to share a couple of useful notes before we get started. Today's webinar will be available on demand after the session. We will send you an email on how to access the video and the presentation. The presentation will be in English, and you can access simultaneous interpretation in French by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Just look at the bottom of the screen if you require French. There's a flag, a French flag. You also receive the French slides and a reminder today. Vince will be answering your questions at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions in the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of the screen. You'll also be able to vote for your preferred questions, which will help us prioritize. Finally, please use the chat box to let us know of any technical issue that you encounter, and we will do our best to help you. So, without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Vince Pietropaolo. Vince, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. Unfortunately, I'm not in the East Coast, one of my favorite places to be in Canada. But definitely, hopefully will make my way there at some point. So welcome everybody. Today, we're going to talk about vicarious trauma and its impact on service providers. My understanding is that you all work with immigrant and refugee populations, and you're exposed to all kinds of stories and traumatic material and content that have certainly both a mental and physical impact upon you. So I work at COSTI, as Carolyn mentioned. COSTI is a fairly large organization in Toronto, and we have just recently, over the last 3 years, developed a refugee mental health program where we have psychiatrists and social workers, as well as primary care physicians who are treating some of the mental and physical issues that arise with our refugees here in Toronto. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to, I like to start first by having very clear definition of what trauma is. So we're going to spend some time looking at a number of different definitions of trauma. I will also then spend some time defining burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. These are all words that are very familiar to you, ones that you often, I'm sure, have thought about or have had discussion about. But just so we're all on the same page, we develop a common understanding. I will define them for you. So let's start with trauma. I'd like to start my presentation today with an image, a very powerful image, and definitely one that most of you may have seen, but I want you to look at this image from, I guess, the perspective of two ways. The first perspective is the one you're looking at it and you're experiencing all kinds of emotions, fear, horror, anxiety, pain, empathy. Now think of and imagine yourself on that boat. Imagine what it would be like to actually be on the boat and have For some, as you can see, have a life jacket, others don't. Being in the middle of an ocean. So this is the trauma that they are experiencing. That's the perspective. And for us workers, we're only getting a secondary trauma, which is we're experiencing not what it's actually like to be on that particular boat, but what the after effects is as you either see the images, create the visualizations yourself, or listen orally what it was like to experience such a horrific and traumatic event. So those are the two perspectives to think about. However, we're going to spend most of our time really looking at the perspective of once we hear the stories and we are exposed to the content, how that affects us psychologically and emotionally. So let's see. So what is trauma? So regardless of its source, trauma contains three common elements. For the most part, it's unexpected, a person is unprepared, and there was really nothing that a person can do to stop it from happening. So simply put, traumatic events are beyond a person's control. So essentially, when you experience trauma, there's a part of it where the person who's directly experiencing the trauma has no real control. So whether it's a situation where someone is sexually abused, it's the perpetrator that has control, and that person is helpless and vulnerable. Whether it is bombing in a particular village, hamlet, or a city where there's no control, you cannot stop the bombing. Or if we look at other traumatic events, some that are environmental, where you have a typhoon or a hurricane, those are all common types of traumas. And again, they all follow within those three common elements. And this comes from the Manitoba Trauma Information and Education Center. So I also want to make sure that people have a good understanding of complex trauma. So complex trauma is different from trauma in that it is a repeated trauma that happens over a period of time. It is within, again, a particular time frame, often in a specific setting and within a specific relation. Examples of complex trauma would be a perpetrator who sexually assaults an individual over a period of time, and it's frequent and repeated. So the difference between a trauma and a complex trauma is the frequency, the cumulative effect, and the fact that it is repeated. It often results in direct harm to an individual. Now, in terms of treatment, but also in terms of how it impacts an individual, that differs again from one individual to another. You can have one traumatic event happen and the implications can be just as dramatic and just as painful and harming as a number of traumas over a period of time, like complex trauma. So we have defined trauma, we have defined complex trauma, and now we're going to define post-traumatic stress disorder, which most of you are very familiar with. And it usually develops after someone has been exposed to a terrifying event or has been through an ordeal in which intense physical harm occurred or was threatened. And often the case is when one is experiencing a near-death experience. So bombs going off everywhere, the intense fear from perhaps a tidal wave coming through the shore, or some perpetrator who is exposing you. It could also be in relationships where there is severe emotional and psychological distress. Sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorder have persistent and frightening thoughts and memories of that particular ideal. Essentially, when we look at post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis, we look at for the most part, three core elements or core clusters. The first is that there is an invasive, repeated and re-experiencing of the particular event. So that could be one who experiences nightmares, for instance, or visualizations when you have daydreams, any kind of intrusive or repeated re-experiencing of event. The second cluster would be heightened emotional response. So you're hypervigilant. There's extreme intense emotions related to the event. So it could be extreme anxiety, it could be extreme fear or panic. So the fact that you're experiencing the emotion associated with the particular event in this heightened state. The third cluster of symptoms relates to avoidance behavior and the avoidance of particular cues or prompts that relate back to the trauma. So it could be, for instance, certain sounds. Often people avoid, for instance, a subway because of the screeching sound that simulates perhaps sounds that they hear in conflict or war areas. It could be any particular cueing or prompting an event and the avoidance that is associated with it. So for perhaps maybe going into a crowd, so people avoid crowds. So it's behavior, again, that is directly due because of the event or related to the event, and a person develops avoidance behaviors. So those three cluster of symptoms need to be present in order to get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we talk about refugees specifically and their experiences around trauma that contribute to post-traumatic stress disorder, you often will see depression, anxiety, irritability or aggressiveness. So what you might see in someone who has experienced a traumatic event is, and what we've seen in our work is the withdrawal or the avoidance that you might see in depression, the pacing, the physical agitation, or the breathing difficulties that you might see with anxiety, or the aggressive outburst or irritability that come with it. And they may range depending on the person's an individual's personality, their level of resiliency, their coping mechanisms, and how they have processed the particular event. We often see refugees isolating, social withdrawal, again with memory issues and concentration problems. Keep in mind that trauma affects the memory. There's invasive flashbacks that often come, and when it's unexpectedly or unconsciously cued, for instance, you could have an individual that even can be triggered from smells. So certain smells can draw up images or invasive flashbacks, and then again, this will help. This will actually interfere with your ability to concentrate and your attention span, and also retrieving. Keep in mind that we want to automatically, the body or the mind wants to forget the particular event because it's too painful, too difficult to process, and the emotions are so intense. So then we can experience, or one can experience, issues with memory. Desensitization of others' feelings, so there isn't that kind of empathy. So when you're working with refugees, you may see some of these particular characteristics, that distance, or almost in a way that almost paranoia, that distrust of others, and this is what trauma does. It desensitizes you to others' feelings. One way often we see refugees or people who experience trauma is alcohol becomes a maladaptive coping mechanism, as well as drug use, and that is the misuse of drugs, whether they're illegal or even you can see it with prescribed drugs, as a way, again, to numb, as a way to mitigate, or as a way to regulate some of these intense emotions that you see. You often might see deep-seated rage. Then again, this is the irritability that you might see. So this is, I want you to think of trauma as you become trauma-informed. What we're hearing about now is having trauma-informed organizational policies or trauma-informed work. So keeping in mind of what trauma, how trauma affects a refugee, an individual who's had this kind of exposure, you might see these behaviors. Once we understand these behaviors, we can relate and have a better way of building rapport. last symptom is lack of sleep, of course, and nightmares. Often very difficult because nightmares will wake somebody up, or severe anxiety people have, and they become restless and have difficulty sleeping. And of course, if you're depressed, sleep is often compromised. So these are some experiences that contribute to post-traumatic stress disorder, and these are symptoms you might see in your clients. So we're going to break up some of the symptoms of trauma and in a couple of categories. Here's the first category I want to talk to you about, which is kind of that fight response. So what you might want to see in someone who has symptoms of trauma is crying, hands and fists, a desire to punch or rip. These are aggressive. So when you're ready in that fight-flight response that is innate in all of us, when we feel that intense emotion like anxiety, we either want to fight or we want to flee. So often you might see symptoms of trauma. You might see the grinding of teeth. These are people ready to fight. This is the agitation. This is the aggression. This is the irritability you might see. A desire to stomp, kick, smash with legs, feet. You might see this in children, but also in adults. Feelings of anger, rage. And you might often have homicidal or suicidal feelings. Keep in mind, with suicide, always check for homicide, because that is like a double-edged knife. It's the other side. So if one has suicidal feelings and that is aggression turned inwards, it can change and become aggression that is outwards towards harming others. This is why always in mental health assessments, when you have a psychiatrist, a social worker, as part of their assessment, looking at suicidal feelings or thoughts, they often will ask about harming others as well. In a fight response, you'll also have a stomach that's knotted, nausea, or burning sensations as well. This is the flight response that we've talked about. So you have in a flight response, you have restless legs, feet, numbness in legs, the shallow breathing that comes with anxiety, big darting eyes. You might have leg or foot movement. You might often see as people sit in their chair that they're tapping their foot, or you might have what you see as restless legs. The fidgetiness you see, which is different from or similar to ADD, that sense of feeling trapped and very tense. Sense of running in life and one activity into the next. You might see with people who have full of anxiety is they tend to rush things. There isn't that calm approach, and they're moving from one particular event to the next. And then excessive exercising oftentimes as a way to process this intense emotion. There's also the other symptom. So we have fight, flight, and then freeze. This is feeling stuck in some part of the body, that cold, frozen, numb feeling, that stiffness you might see, or the heaviness, the holding of breath, the restricted breathing, that sense of dread, heart pounding, and decreased heart rate, and sometimes can increase. So keep all these symptoms in mind as we talk about vicarious trauma, because these are the symptoms that one who experiences trauma will have, but it's not uncommon that these are the feelings, these are the emotions, these are the behaviors that then get transferred that a service provider will have to process. So what is the impact of trauma on others? Well, it can affect one or more members of a family. If an individual, we often saw this with Vietnam vets, where they come home and they have difficulty with their partners, difficulty with their children. So you can see that a traumatic event can have an impact on those very close, and family members, because definitely it can affect relationships. As we went through some of the behaviors, some of the emotions, you can see how this has an impact on building relationships, on developing relationships, whether it's in work situations, or whether it's family, or whether it's in social situations. Service providers can be affected after hearing stories and witnessing the suffering of trauma survivors. And of course, this is vicarious trauma, which we'll get into more detail later. So let's now move. So we've developed an understanding of trauma. We've gone through essentially what trauma is, what are the psychological, emotional, and behavioral symptoms of trauma that we often see in our clients. And what I often say to people is that I've had many film directors who really have managed to convey that feeling or that behavior on the screen. The movie that I always like is Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. And the first scene of that movie, if anybody has seen that movie, where he slows the camera down and there's fast-paced action as the soldiers are embarking from their naval ships and heading onto the beachheads. You will see that there's bombs and machine guns going off, and that is a feeling that is often associated, dissociative feeling that trauma victims feel when they're immersed in the trauma. So if you get a chance, Saving Private Ryan, it's a great visualization of the muffled sounds and of the feelings that one experiences during a traumatic event. And this is maybe like the feelings that you will feel when you're hearing stories that are being related by clients. So moving on. So let's talk about workplace stress. So most workplaces have definitely a level of stress. There's always fears with the way with funding these days, of being laid off, of programs being shut down. So that in itself is a certain level of stress that one experiences day to day. The expectations with no increase in your job and the job satisfaction often associated in working with community-based agencies in the kind of work that we do. Definitely more expectations, often depending on the nature of your workplace. Is there validation from supervisors and upper management or from colleagues as well? There can be workplace bullying, and of course you're often dealing with clients that bring challenges and difficulties. So there's definitely a level of stress in every workplace, specifically one in community-based settings where you're dealing with clients with complex needs and the kinds of challenges that we see in our work. So what's our response to stress? Well, we have burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. So I'm going to define all three. So why don't we start out with burnout? So burnout, you can often see this maybe perhaps in yourself or maybe in your colleagues. It's often indicated by cynicism, depression, lethargy, and it's not a simple result of working long hours. Keep this in mind. This is not, burnout doesn't just come from working long hours. This occurs when you're not in control of how you carry out your job, when you're working towards goals that don't resonate with you, when you lack that kind of social support. So it's not about working 80-hour weeks. It's really about a sense of purpose when they're not aligned with what your particular goals are. So we might see burnout, for instance, a banker who has an empathetic, intuitive, and generous side to them and is not getting the kind of, but he may get the financial rewards, but is not getting the personal satisfaction out of their jobs. So you might get that cynicism or that depression. That is also, keep in mind, part of burnout. It is a psychological process where the goals you are working towards in your work are not resonating with you and you're feeling isolated, you're not getting the kind of support. So that is burnout. And again, as you can see, it's not related necessarily to client work and your relationship with the client or stories client are telling you. Compassion fatigue, on the other hand, is the natural, predictable, treatable, and preventable unwanted consequence of working with people who suffer. So this compassion fatigue comes from engaging with clients over a period of time. And I apologize for It looks like my slides have a mind of their own and are jumping on me. So getting back to compassion fatigue, it is the unwanted consequence of being around, interacting, supporting, and working with clients who are in extreme emotional states like suffering. It's an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped, to the degree that it can create what we call secondary traumatic stress for the helper. It's cumulative, and it's not necessarily specific to trauma work. So this doesn't have to be exposure to people who are suffering, who've had traumatic events happen. For instance, you could be working with people who are afflicted with some kind of physical disability, or perhaps some physical illness, or even mental illness not related to trauma, for instance, but working with someone who has schizophrenia or bipolar and who is in an emotional state of suffering. So over a period of time, the feelings you have as a worker, you have that fatigue, it starts to weigh on you. And again, it is not related to any specific trauma that your client may have experienced or one that they're sharing with you, but the nature of their condition, their state, and it could be also working with extreme poverty. So this is what compassion fatigue is. Again, it differs from burnout, which is purpose and goal related, and this is exposure over a period of time with people who are suffering. Now, vicarious trauma has its own definition, and this is the cumulative transformative, and here's the key word, transformative effect on the helper of working with survivors of traumatic life events, both positive and negative according to McCann and Perlman. So the effects, again, can be both positive and negative. We usually talk about the negative effects, although some of the positive effects of working with people who've been through traumatic events is the resiliency that clients bring, and how through their stories and their resiliency, we build resiliencies as well. It is repeated exposure to a trauma narrative that may affect, and here's another key word, so it's transformative, and it affects personal sense of safety, trust, and control, according to Newell and McNeil. So think of this in terms of how it alters your worldview. So when we talk about worldview, it doesn't have to be international. It could be your present worldview. So we're looking at how it transforms you. So what you're feeling and thinking, right, while working with people with trauma, and how you start to look at your personal safety, your trust, and your ability to control. So this is key when we're talking about vicarious trauma. This is how it differs with burnout, and definitely this is how it differs from compassion fatigue. So if you look at the three, I want you to think of the three as very, very different. Not one does not lead into the other, but three are very, very different, and the three impact service providers in different ways. So who's at risk of developing vicarious trauma? So there are multiple exposure. People definitely who have multiple exposure have increased risks. So if you are seeing clients who've been exposed to trauma daily or weekly, and it is a big part of your job, you're definitely more at risk than someone, let's say, who occasionally will work with someone who's experienced a particular trauma, maybe once every 3 months. So when we look at the risk factors even more, we look at your own personal vulnerabilities. So what does that mean? So what that means is, what is your personal makeup? What is your resiliency? How resilient are you? What is your capacity to withstand? And you often see this, that you are going to, everyone will respond differently to different stories. It depends on their personal resiliency and also their personal experiences. Your working conditions, what are your working conditions like? Are they safe? Is there protection? Is there times to debrief? Do you have colleagues that you can openly speak to about what you're feeling, what you're thinking? Then again, work-related traumatic or grief loss. So has someone experienced a particular loss, or has there been a traumatic event that has happened at work, direct exposure to a particular trauma or indirect trauma. And then what's the system? Is there a systems failure? Not necessarily in the organization, but even beyond. And again, the social cultural context, and this is not just with respect to where you work, but even greater into society, where you're from, the values, the principles that one has learned. So all these taken into context, and as you look at them, and that will affect an individual differently. This is why you often can see, so for instance, when we look at trauma, you have soldiers who can return from war and been exposed to incredible amounts of trauma. They come back and it's as if they didn't miss a beat. They can go back to work. They can go back into their relationships. So there's a certain capacity, there's a certain resiliency, and then others can come back being exposed to a similar particular traumatic event and have difficulty functioning. So we all have different responses, and it all depends on so many factors, and here are some of the factors. So keep those in mind when you're looking at how trauma affects you, but specifically when you're looking at vicarious trauma. So the impact of trauma work on trauma workers. So we all, we look at, when we're working with clients, we all have an empathetic engagement with traumatized clients. We want to build rapport, we want to actively listen, we want to engage, but we have negative emotions and distress. And somatic responses is how our body responds. So often when we hear stories of distress, we can have our chest cave in, we can develop somatic responses like headaches, dizziness, because you got to remember that the stories you're hearing come with a profound, bountiful basket of emotions, and you absorb those emotions and you're processing those emotions. And as you listen, hear, you can develop headaches, you can be in shock. Now, if we follow this particular, what might seem as a confusing, if we go up, there are negative emotions, distress, somatic responses, but with good coping and organizational support or informal support, good self-care, which we'll be talking about at our next webinar, an optimistic view, spirituality, which is very, very important, and that is a sense of purpose, being in touch with your own spirituality, knowing how to separate and have good boundaries with your clients, and over time, the distress will decrease. However, you can also, if you follow from an empathetic engagement, and if you go south and you go down, you can be in shock, you can question and meaning and making, and this is where you see the kind of change where your world becomes safe, mistrusting others, there's less compassion, you become very suspicious, you look at how your worldview is altered, you look at the values and how the self is compromised, and then you look at your day-to-day life. So for instance, if we are in shock and we're experiencing vicarious trauma, our worldview, our world becomes unsafe. We start maybe perhaps to mistrust others. What happens to the self is you can become less compassionate, become very suspicious of the motivation. You often can hear people say, oh, these refugees, they're just fiending their symptoms. They're just looking at being on disability. They're looking at ways to get financial security. So we start to become suspicious of their motivation. We misinterpret perhaps symptoms or their state. And how does it affect your day-to-day life? Distance. If you look at remember we talked about avoidance or withdrawal. Oftentimes with vicarious trauma, you can distance yourself from your intimate relationships in your family, from your social support, which are friends, but also from your colleagues. So this is a very complex chart that really looks at the trajectory from the initial engagement with clients and how you are impacted by the traumatic stories and contents that you hear. And you see the change and what happens. So, you know, and it also, in worldviews, it gives you the opposite. So for instance, if your world is becoming unsafe, and that is what you're experiencing because you've been traumatized, the opposite of that is human resiliency, appreciation of life. Remember we talked about how vicarious trauma can have both a positive and a negative effect. So if you channel and process what you've been exposed to properly, you can also value the importance of family and friends. The self, you have compassion, wisdom, self-awareness, self-worth. You become a better professional, social activism, and better parenting. So you see the changes that's in that box underneath. So if you follow the particular trajectories, you will see both positive and negative impacts of vicarious trauma. So here's some severe indicators of VT or vicarious trauma. Often we might see this as well. If anybody watches The Sopranos, which was a series about organized crime. In that particular show, there was a psychiatrist who was treating one of the members, or at least the key figure in the organized crime family. So she was being exposed to all kinds of horrific stories about murder, about fraud, about manipulation, just distressing stories about a violent, dark side of human behavior. And if people follow the storyline, what they found out as she was trying to cope with the vicarious trauma of being exposed to the contents of those stories, she developed a dependency with alcohol and started to misuse alcohol in order to regulate the intense emotions that were coming from that work. So some of the severe indicators of maladaptive coping when you're exposed to trauma, again, increased dependency on substance. It doesn't have to be alcohol. It could be prescription drugs. It could be benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety medication. Compulsive or process addictions like overspending. We often see with technology now and technology use. Process addictions are things like engaging in gaming, engaging in shopping. This becomes a distraction, a way of coping. But if it affects your functioning, for instance, if you're spending too much money by shopping, which again, that's an example of a process addiction, or overeating in order to fill the void or to distract yourself from the uncomfortable emotions, and gambling. These are examples of behaviors when the trauma or vicarious trauma is extreme and that it is not being processed and remains within you. You can have reactive behaviors like aggression or bouts of crying unexpectedly, or at times where you can't control a particular emotion and you go into crying behavior. Often what you might see with service providers who are struggling with vicarious trauma, again, are what we call the somatic complaints or chronic physical ailments to come: headaches, migraines, back pain, shoulder pain, neck pain. These are common when one is exposed to ongoing cumulative effects of trauma. And the key here is poor self-care. You often will see this in colleagues or in yourself. When one is exposed over a period of time, it's as if these events, these clients live in our heads. It could lead to feelings of anxiety, depression. And we often, when we look at the appearance, if you ever have been assessed by a psychiatrist or a social worker or psychologist, one of the things they look at is appearance. How does that person appear? Disheveled, neat? Is the person taking care of themselves? So often a disheveled appearance or poor hygiene. It's arriving late at work. Often you might see with service providers who have difficulty and are experiencing vicarious trauma is they may avoid work or come in late. And it's a way of avoiding the kinds of intense emotions or the cues and prompts that come. And you might see a disheveled kind of appearance or poor hygiene, again, because of depression and the lack of self-care. So self-care is very, very, very important. And in this It is the fact that either on an organizational level or on an individual level, when we don't take care of ourselves, when we're not processing the emotions, when we're not eating properly, when we're not exercising, when we're not processing and debriefing, and we're not getting the kinds of emotional support that we need in order to process some of the difficult content or visualizations that we get from the stories. This can often lead, so self-care is very important. Rest and self-care are very, very important. When you take time to replenish your spirit, it allows you to serve others from the overflow. You cannot serve from an empty vessel. And this is a quote that I like, because it's like a phone. Think of your phone. And we often see people take so much time and care and where their charger is, and is my charger in my bag, or where did I leave my charger? So you cannot use your phone if you don't replenish it, if you don't recharge it. And the same applies in our work. As a service provider, if you're not resting and if you're not taking care of your emotions, if you're not processing your thoughts, if you're not nourishing your spirit, you cannot then work from an empty vessel and take care compassionately of others. Because that's our role, to take care of others, not to judge, not to become cynical and suspicious, but to be compassionate, to interpret behavior from a positive, trauma-informed perspective. So self-care is key to at least negate, reduce, if not eliminate, the consequences of vicarious trauma. Here are some of my references, and I am now happy to answer any questions. I'd like to thank you all for your patience. I hope the information that I have shared with you comes from my knowledge base, from my experience in working in the field, and I hope it'll have an impact on your work. I'm more than happy to take any questions related to the material, or even if you have situations that come up at work and need clarification, or any way that I can use my experience and my knowledge to help illustrate and make this work a little more, I think, helpful to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vince. That was certainly a rich presentation. We'll go ahead now and we'll take 15 minutes for questions now. So just as a reminder to everyone, there is a Q&A box which is down at the bottom of your screen. So this is where we're inviting you to type in your questions. And there's also a function that you can vote for any questions that you see that others may have put there that you would also be interested in hearing. So I don't see any quite yet, but hopefully people are able to find that Q&A box and ask any questions. It's a tremendous opportunity, Vince, to have you with us and to be able to, answer these questions on such an important topic. And
Sure.
yeah, so I'm not sure, is there anything else just while we're waiting for a few questions that you would like to highlight?
No, I just want to highlight that the work we all engage in and do is incredibly important, and never to underestimate the impact over a period of time. We don't want to lose our shine. Certainly this work attracts incredibly committed people, and we're not in the work, I think, to become unwell. We're in our work to make sure that we reach our potential. So I cannot highlight the importance of self-care, which we're going to spend time next week talking about. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to highlight that.
Mm-hmm. Great. I see some people are who might have joined us a few minutes later, is that just to let people know that yes, definitely we will be sharing the slides that you've seen today, and also this webinar will be available on demand, so you will be able to visit the ARAISA website and either have the presentation in French or in English. That will be there on our website, so no problem there if you didn't catch the first few minutes. And also a recording. So yes, the webinar in demand will be both the slides and the presentation, just as it's on roll today. So I have a question here. Somebody is asking, Vince, is it possible to experience burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma? So I'm assuming if somebody's saying, can you experience all three of those at the same time?
Um, I think so. In some ways, they're separate, but they do lead into one another. So as you can see, burnout, again, if you start to question your purpose, if it's not aligned with your value system, with your particular goals, definitely if you become cynical. But keep one thing in mind is to have vicarious trauma, you have to have exposure with clients who are conveying or communicating a traumatic event. So so if you're working at a bank, perhaps as a financial planner, and maybe your client is a refugee who then will tell you about a specific traumatic event, you can. The generally speaking, they're not cumulative, but definitely there are elements of each in every one, right? So when you look at compassion fatigue, you can have compassion fatigue. So if you're working with refugees, yes, you can have compassion fatigue. You can become overwhelmed. You're exposed to all kinds of suffering, right? And then you're exposed to traumatic material and content. But if you're working, for instance, for, let's say, the Salvation Army, and you're working with homelessness and poverty, and there's not particularly, you're not exposed to any particularly traumatic material or content, you don't necessarily have vicarious trauma, but your compassion may run out if you're not taking care of yourself. And you become overwhelmed. This is where you become cynical. You look at your clients differently. And this is often what you might see when people will say, oh, why don't they just, oh, they've been on welfare all their lives, or they've been on, government handouts. Why don't they just go work? This is the kind of cynicism that kind of comes in, where you start to judge without facts, without understanding, as opposed to looking at a client. So yeah, you can have elements of three, but keep in mind, again, look carefully at the definitions. Burnout is about purpose, aligning with values, right? Compassion fatigue is about the suffering and cumulative exposure to the suffering, but not necessarily, and not trauma. Vicarious trauma is specific, that you are exposed to traumatic content and material. So that's how we delineate and discriminate from the three. But yes, if you're working with refugees and exposed to trauma, you can have all three if that's not the right place for you and you start to question your work or your impact. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Vince. We have another question here asking, do you know of any organization initiative aimed to support staff? And I would also remind people that our webinar next Tuesday will specifically look at self-care and staff policies. But Vince, quickly on that, do you know of any organization initiative aimed to support staff?
A wonderful organization out in Manitoba that specifically works with staff and has developed activities and policies as well to help staff. So for instance, I can tell you at COSTI, one of the things we do is we have flexibility in work hours. So people can incorporate time off in their day so they can pay attention to self-care. So that's an organizational policy. I'm going to talk more about it next week into more specifics, but there's also even more, and I don't want to get into examples, but one thing I want to say to people too is what organizations are doing today as well, and this is something fairly new, but they're developing trauma-informed policies. So trauma-informed workplace, which looks at not only how to work with clients, but also how to take care of staff. So it becomes part of a policy, no different from sexual harassment policy, no different from health and safety policy. So the care of staff is coming to the consciousness of executives, of boards, to know that staff needs to be looked after, that the risk for developing vicarious trauma when exposed to clients who have traumatic histories. So I know that's very broad and vague. I didn't want to get into too much detail. Hopefully that answers that question.
Great. Another question here for you, Vince. How do you support coworkers that you think are experiencing compassion fatigue due to how they speak about clients and their situations?
Well, that is an excellent question. I think we're often, as workers, we've often worked with somebody who at times can become either bitter or cynical. To me, the best thing would always be in a non-judgmental way to approach the person in a very supportive way, to maybe highlight and just gives kind of feedback. So say, I noticed that you've been talking about your clients in a negative way or in a suspicious way. How are you doing? How are they affecting you? So also with open-ended questions. So you're offering support and you're also conveying a sense of understanding. And often when you do have that dialogue, as opposed to a monologue, or as opposed to going to, for instance, a supervisor, you will have that empathetic approach. You want that person themselves to identify that perhaps the judgments, the cynicism, the negativity. You can also say how you've noticed that the person has been very, very negative. And you can say how it impacts, because it does impact morale. It impacts team. We often work in teams, so it does impact. So I would approach the person in a very supportive, empathetic way first, with open-ended questions. And then also maybe perhaps offer some supports. You might want to do it, hey, let's go for a walk. I think you need a break. It sounds like you're reaching your limit. So these are supportive statements that you want to give to that person. Often you got to keep in mind, often, we look at burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. The person who experiences may not necessarily be aware. So part of your support and part of your questions are to raise awareness for that person at a conscious level, what you may see. We as Freud said, and as many people said, 80% of our life is unconscious, right? We're not even aware of our own behaviors. We don't take time. Others may see it. So that's how I would approach it.
Great. Okay. We have another question. Someone who's noted that sometimes there's both parties who are engaging with each other have experienced trauma in the past, and those have an impact on each other, and mostly it can be negative. So do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah. So if I understood the question correctly, I'm going to reframe it, is that you're talking about two service providers who they themselves has experienced their own trauma and are working with trauma victims, and their engagement is negative amongst each other. Is that the question?
I'm guessing, and perhaps the person who asked the question can clarify again in the Q&A box, but I'm thinking it could also be somebody who is perhaps a settlement worker who has experienced trauma, also engaging with someone who has experienced trauma.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that, and this is why it's important to have a trauma-informed policy in your organization, is to recognize that we all, in our histories, may have been exposed to some traumatic event in our lives. We all, Canada is made up from a diverse background of people coming in from all over the world with different experiences in family, in their countries of origin. So when you're working with trauma clients, it's not uncommon for your own trauma to be cued and prompted, even if you think it may be under control. Now, we don't have the right to approach somebody and ask them about, that's a very confidential. Again, we can look at behaviors. So if we become knowledgeable, and because we want to reduce the harm to self and then the potential harm to clients. So if your coworker or anybody you work with, and if you care about them very much, you again always want to approach them in a supportive, empathetic way, and you want to highlight perhaps behaviors, perhaps emotions, and you might say to somebody, "I noticed you appeared angry. Is everything okay?" What you want to do is validate the emotion, perhaps, but not interpret or approach somebody, which is say, "Hey, have you had trauma in your history? Did something happen to you?" You're putting somebody on the spot, and that person can freeze, again, because they may have a very personal event that have occurred. So again, open-ended, supportive, focusing on behaviors, focusing on impact, on the potential harm, and just say, "I noticed that," if you're a supervisor, you can say, "I noticed that you're coming in late a lot, and this is a new behavior that I've seen. Do you want to talk about it? Is there something about it that I should know? Is there any way that I could support you?" So that we're opening a dialogue of understanding, and that's the key, I think. Again, not to be invasive, not to probe, but to create a safe environment. Remember when we talked about vicarious trauma as having an impact? The personal sense of safety, that is compromised in a person. So by intruding and probing, that again creates more suspicion and can compromise safety. So that's how again, and you don't want to ask about someone's particular, unless of course they volunteer that information to you, but we shouldn't be probing for it. We're just going to remark on the behavior. I hope that answers the question, if I understood it correctly.
Great. I think we have time for perhaps one more question. So I'm going to choose one here that from someone who hasn't mentioned one before. So this is from someone who works at ISANS, who points out that they have a crisis intervention team to lean on, and really appreciate that they're fortunate to have those amazing people. The question is, if I have a client in my office for language counseling and something comes up where I feel a referral to my colleagues would be important, what is the best way to introduce this to my client?
Again, that feedback, which is to say, I notice that either you have a sad expression, I notice that you're fidgety, and if they're not disclosing any particular, it's easy if someone discloses and says that for instance, I'm in an abusive relationship, then that is an opening for one to say, there's help, there's ways that we can help you, here are some resources, or here's a referral. But when the person doesn't disclose, and you are observing, I think it's important to give that feedback and say, here's some observation. I'm just going to check in with you, and I want to make sure that you're okay. And here are some resources available. And I'm also someone who can facilitate a referral, and I want to help you because I'm observing and I have concerns. And you want to allow that person not to be defensive. Again, by being empathetic, by having open-ended questions, you're allowing that person to tell you their story and to let you know where they're at. And if you do that, again, what you want to do is build trust. So even in that time, if you don't have the opportunity, or if the person declines a referral, you've built trust. And we often see this with link teachers at COSTI, is that they may decline a referral or resources, but then if the situation becomes more dire, or there's an event that happens and things worsen, they'll come back because there's that trust, because you weren't invasive, you were supportive. So that's how I would approach that.
Great. Okay, thanks. I think we've gotten through most of the questions. There are a couple that we haven't. Excellent questions that people have had, but unfortunately the hour is almost up. But we will try to address the remaining questions in writing and send them to you by email. So at this point, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. A reminder that part 2 of this series is taking place next Tuesday, February 25th, at the same time with Vince, and it will be about staff care policies. So don't forget to register. We'll send you the link by email. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, particularly to our presenter, Vince Pietropaolo, and we will see you next time.
Thank you all, and thanks to all the participants for sharing and posing wonderful questions and allowing me to give some insights. And thank you very much for moderating. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks.